So when we bless others and they discover God's forgiveness and love, they are realizing God's grace. Just like when you discovered God's forgiveness and love in your own life, you began to realize God's grace. Now, God's grace has been there since the beginning, since the day you were born. God's grace has been reaching out to you and calling you into relationship with God. A grace that is new and fresh every day. It's not one moment in time, it's continual. And when you realize God's grace, you have to respond to it. When you realize God's grace, you have to respond, but the great question is, do you respond positively or did you respond negatively? Did you receive God's grace or did you reject God's grace? God's grace is not forceful. God's grace is not oppressive. God's grace does not come upon us and we cannot say no to it. God's grace is given in relationship, called into relationship, and we have the choice to be in that relationship, the God-given choice. But God's grace demands a response, our decision. And if we receive God's grace, and we continue to receive God's grace, then we begin to develop in Christ-likeness. And as we develop in Christ-likeness, we are expected to help others develop in Christ-likeness, which is a second statement in our mission statement, or second sentence in our mission statement. The best way, I would even say the biblical way, that we help people to develop in Christ-likeness is by investing in them. In John's first letter, in chapter 2, the disciple John writes, "Those who say they live in God should live their lives as Jesus did." So if we respond to God's grace positively and we receive it, our lives will be affected by it, and our lives will begin to reflect the very life and the very character of Jesus. That's what we're called to do. That's what Jesus says in the scriptures. That's what his disciples continue to say in the scriptures. But if we just look at Jesus, the entirety of the Gospels, the 4 gospel narratives, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we read the life of Jesus, because John says those who say they live in God should live their lives as Jesus did. So let's look at just the life of Jesus. Now, in church terms, we can say we know why he was born, we know why he died, and we know that he was an example to us why he lived. But let's look at what he did during those years, the years that we have written. His first 30 years, we've got, like 6 chapters total. Then there's all these chapters written about 3 years of his life. What did he do during those 3 years? Well, if you look at the whole narrative, he did a lot of little things, he did a lot of moments. But throughout that whole time, he spent 3 years calling, instructing, and nurturing 12 young men. We know there were others. There were others because it constantly says, and the others, but we don't know how many. We don't know who all was there, but we know there were 12. These 12 that Jesus spent 3 years teaching. He constantly had to teach them in various ways, through stories, sometimes very directly, sometimes kind of reverse psychology on them, sometimes various ways he spent teaching them constantly. He cared for them. He took care of their needs. He supplied what they needed. They had food because they were with him. They had the things they needed because they were with him. He made sure they were taken care of. And then he encouraged them. Go and do what I've shown you to do, and then come back and let's talk about it. Go and do the things that I've told you to do, then come back and let's talk about it. Yeah, I realize you don't think that you can do these things, but trust me, you're ready to do these things. He spent those 3 years instructing, nurturing, encouraging. 3 years investing in 12 guys. And they were invited into every part of his life. There wasn't a place he went that they were not there. They tagged along to everything. Family events like weddings. Everything he did, they were there. Almost that group of guys he couldn't get rid of. Even the days that he might have went, I'm done. I don't know. But they were in every part of his life. And we can easily go, well, that was a Jewish cultural thing. Well, John says those who say they live in God should live their lives as Jesus did. 3 years, 12 guys. Now, I'm not saying that's the formula. I don't think Jesus would say this is the formula, 3 years, 12 guys, and at the end of 3 years, you get rid of those 12 and get a new 12. I don't think that's the formula for that, so don't hear that. But this is where the next 2 letters in this idea of blessing come in. We learned about bless last week. Begin with prayer, listen, eat, share, or serve and share. We heard that a lot last night. People making comments. That was great. The next letters, the I and the N. So right now we're just blessing. That's what we're just blessing. Apostrophe. We're leaving the G off right now. So just blessing. The I and the N, instruct and nurture. Instruct people. When we begin to invest in someone to bless them, we have to invest everything we've got. It means that they become a central focus of us. And we begin to instruct them in the knowledge that we have. We begin to instruct them in the things that we've learned, helping them learn their direction, helping them learn their callings, helping them learn their giftings. We give direction, we give information. Thought it was interesting as I looked at the definition of instruct. One of the definitions of instruct is to give authority. The last thing Jesus says to his disciples, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, now go. He gave them authority. Now, I'm not going to say I'm Jesus and I can give that kind of authority, but I can point to Jesus who gives them authority. And I can instruct them in the ways of finding Jesus. The greatest thing you can ever instruct someone how to do is how to pray, how to hear God. If we believed and if we truly believed it and truly began everything by just teaching people how to hear the voice of God, the church would constantly be in the right place. We nurture. This is about character. To care for and encourage someone's development, to nurture them, to bring them along, and when they have those days that they feel down, to stand next to them and help them stand, to have those days when they feel like they can rush ahead and to kind of pull the reins back and go, hold on. I love the excitement, but we're not there yet. Let's learn some things along the way. When they fall down and skin their knees, to pick them up and go, good try. Let's do it again. Let's try it again. 1 Corinthians 11:1, Paul says, you should imitate me as I imitate Christ. Now, Paul's not putting himself in the place of Christ here. This was Paul investing into the lives of those who had discovered God's grace. This was Paul seeing a group of new believers who had discovered God's grace and were excited about it, and him going, let me show you. Let me invest into your life and help you develop into Christ-likeness. This was Paul instructing. This was Paul nurturing. This was Paul living his life as Jesus lived. And we, in like, are called to live our lives as Jesus did. By investing our lives, your time, your energy, your relationship, your knowledge, we invest our lives into others and participate in developing them into Christ-likeness. by instructing, and by nurturing. This is how we invest. So let's begin to do that in people's lives.